Welcome to the second day of the California Preservation Foundation Conference. I have just a couple of things. This session is Advancing Racial and Social Equity, Strategies for the Historic Preservation Field. We have quite a few fun things going on today, sessions all day, plus we have a special lunchtime presentation at noon Pacific featuring Dr. Anthea Hartig, and she's the director of the Smithsonian's Museum of American History. That's at noon, and then tonight at 5 o'clock Pacific, we have Wicked Sacramento, and author William Berg is going to be discussing his research and his book about the brothels and the dark side of Sacramento. For everybody who's here, I'm Chris. I'm the Marketing and Development Director for CPF. We want to thank you for coming. Just so you know, so you're familiar with how we work these webinars on Zoom, you can use the chat. We encourage you to use the chat box actually, the whole time that we're giving our presentations. And if you have a question at any time, you can post your question in the Q&A box. At the end, Trudy will be taking the questions and answers. All the sessions are automatically closed captioned. For those of you who'd like to access this feature, you click the closed caption button to view the real-time text transcript of today's session. We're also recording everything, and there'll be all the recordings of the sessions will be available within 1 week of today's session. You'll receive details by email. So now that we've covered the basics, I'm going to turn it over to our panel today.
Hi everyone, I'm Shelley Caltagirone. I'm a cultural heritage specialist with the San Francisco Planning Department. Welcome to our webinar. I'm going to try now to share my screen and get our slides going. Give me 1 second. And if you can hear my toddler in the background, I apologize. I'll try to speak over him. There we go. Can everyone see my screen? Looks it's working. Okay. So today I'm joined by Dylan Delvo from Little Manila Rising in Stockton, Trudy Sandmeyer, Director of Graduate Programs and Heritage Conservation at the University of Southern California. I'm joined by Erica Schultz, Associate Historian Planner at Architectural Resources Group in the Bay Area, and Eliza Tudor, Executive Director of the Nevada County Arts Council. Our agenda today is going to be a series of 5 mini presentations from each of our speakers, addressing how their work is advancing equity in their preservation practice. We're going to start by hearing Dylan's perspective from his work in the Filipino community in Stockton, and we're going to end by hearing from Trudy about her work as a university educator. We want to hold the last 10 minutes for questions from the audience, so if you would submit questions in the chat throughout the webinar, then we can respond to those at the end. I want to thank you for sharing your time with us this morning, especially given the additional stresses everyone is carrying during the pandemic. We hope that today's topic resonates with you and builds upon the knowledge that we are gaining through this shared experience about how racial and social disparities in income, access to healthcare, healthy food, and healthy housing are leaving large portions of the world's population more vulnerable to COVID-19. And I realize that a discussion about how we treat each other's history and heritage may feel less critical than how we ensure equitable access to hospital beds, but I hope we can demonstrate today that this work can promote healing and community building, that it can lead to the beginnings of righting past wrongs, and that ultimately, hopefully, it does change our society. And before we dive into the presentations, I want to frame our discussion of racial equity by offering this definition. The systematic, fair treatment of people of all races that results in equal outcomes while recognizing the historical context and systemic harm done to specific racial groups. As the cartoon illustrates, equity is not just giving everyone the same box to stand on, it's taking into account their height, and justice is not just making sure everyone is getting the assistance they need to overcome a barrier, but removing the barrier itself. Now you may be wondering how this applies to preservation practice. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Here are some of the ideas that we hope you'll consider today while we present our own experiences. First, it is necessary to make the histories of marginalized groups visible in our historic landscape to advance an equitable society in which the contributions and stories of all members of our society are honored. Next, this is Preservation 3.0. This is beyond bricks and mortar historic preservation. We have a responsibility to address the intangible qualities of culture in our current practice, and in order to safeguard living heritage and to preserve the histories of communities who have experienced migration, displacement, dispossession, or other circumstances that have limited their material culture. We also recognize that evaluating and managing the cultural heritage or social history of marginalized communities should be deeply informed by and often led by the community. And last, we understand that a deliberate and measured examination of the historic preservation field is necessary to identify organizational structures and practices that perpetuate racial and social inequities. So now I want to turn it over to Dylan and my colleagues to unpack some of these ideas. And I'll stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me just get my presentation up. All right. Good morning, everyone. It is truly an honor to speak to you on how we've gone about historic preservation. And this is actually the only the second time in 2 months that I've put on a collared shirt. So this really means a lot to me. I want to apologize also ahead of time for the speed and density of this presentation, but I seriously cannot think of any other way to do it. And so as we begin, I just want to remember Dr. Dawn Buhulano Mabalo. And Dawn was our co-founder and my dear friend since the 7th grade. It was her idea to save Little Manila. She saw the beauty of it when the rest of us couldn't. She became one of the foremost Filipino-American historians in the nation, and it is her work that we build upon. Dawn's book, Little Manila's in the Heart, documents the trauma of the past, which leads us to the challenges we have today. Little Manila is one of the few things we have left of this first generation of Filipino immigrants. And so we begin in this Filipino-American experience through American colonization. This takes place after 350 years of Spanish colonization, as America purchases the Philippines in 1899 from Spain. This front page of the Boston Sunday Globe is a part of the narrative of how Filipinos can benefit, quote unquote, benefit from American colonization. This, of course, leads to the Philippine-American War, which is really our first Vietnam that a lot of people don't know about. Over 1 million Filipinos are dead, mainly because of a cholera outbreak that takes place. And of course, this decimates the Philippines and its economy, which leads us to 20 years later, Little Manila. As California agriculture needs a cheap labor force, there's this territory of the United States that allows for cheap labor to come over legally. And so Little Manila in Stockton becomes the largest population of Filipinos in the world outside the Philippines from the 1920s to the 1960s. And this is a community that faced many, many challenges. For example, Filipinos were not able to marry white people in the state of California. The ratio of Filipino men to women was 20-1. And few families actually come from this generation. Filipinos weren't allowed to own property, which means there's no generational wealth creation. There's no money, old money in our community. And so there's very little infrastructure for philanthropy. This, of course, is followed by the Great Depression. Everyone's losing their jobs except for the Filipinos working in the fields. And the narrative of they're taking our jobs and our women begins. And of course, this leads to anti-Filipino sentiment, which would lead to federal legislation, which would actually give independence to the Philippines, limit immigration from doors wide open to just 50 a year. And all Filipinos that are in America would be made illegal to work in America almost overnight, like in some type of undocumented status. And And here's a headline from 1930 at the time. This building is really is just a block away from Little Manila Rising's current location. And just to understand, like, this is like terrorist activity that's taking place at this time. Of course, this leads us to redlining and the further limiting the ability for the creation of generational wealth in our local community. You can see that most of the redlining is taking place in South Stockton. And in the city's redevelopment plan in the 1960s, the community of Little Manila was described as this: the utilization of these old, deteriorated, obsolete, and poorly designed buildings for transient lodgings has encouraged the seasonal influx of large numbers of marginally useful itinerant workers. This would eventually lead to the building of the Crosstown Freeway through the heart of Little Manila and many other communities of color. Of course, this led to the destruction of Little Manila. And this brings us to Don and I as we come back into the community in 1999. And we got there in time to witness the destruction on one of the last two remaining blocks of Little Manila. And this was the headline in the newspaper at the time: corner of history falls to progress. And you'll notice that the word progress is not in quotation marks. The definition of progress was already predetermined. And the definition was this: the building of a McDonald's and 76 station over one of the last remaining blocks of Little Manila. This was the definition of progress 20 years ago. And we quickly realized that in order for us to preserve anything, we had to redefine what progress actually meant in our community. And so as redevelopment continued to threaten what was left, we rallied the residents and businesses in the area to create a counter redevelopment plan. And to make a long story short, led by Don, we worked to stop it, and we did. And a little fun fact, Anthea Hardig, our keynote speaker for today, was a staffer for the National Trust that we were working with at the time, 20 years ago. This left us with one last block, 3 buildings, which led us to this question: how do you get to the preservation of buildings when the humanity and dignity of the human beings who inhabited them are still in question? And so we realized that after that, we had to set out to answer that question. And so Don and I, in our personal experience, we found our history through ethnic studies courses in colleges that weren't in Stockton. We actually had to leave Stockton to learn about Stockton. And so we created ethnic studies after school programs at one of the local high schools, which 9 years later would lead to those students advocating to have ethnic studies being taught at every high school in Stockton Unified. And that has happened, and we actually provide professional development for those teachers now. We teach dance and music. And we honor our undocumented ancestors by standing in allyship to our current day undocumented people of our community. We lead with youth advocacy at all levels of government. And our young people are now the torchbearers for redefining progress in our community. And I spent important minutes this morning sharing the history of our trauma in our community, because if I didn't, this picture wouldn't mean as much. And you wouldn't be able to understand the cultural shift that has taken place in our community over the past 20 years. The Little Manila Historic Site is not just history, it's a story of our resilience. And that the same beliefs that threaten the destruction of our buildings today are the same beliefs that marginalize our community and threaten our health today. In 2016, we counted 127 empty tree wells in the Little Manila area, which led us to an urban greening campaign and trying to access state cap and trade funds with the idea that it's harder to destroy a community that has money actually being invested into it. And although we had support from our mayor, the city manager did not support us. We're a strong city manager city, and so that proposal failed. And it led to the continued disinvestment and marginalization in our community. Also, the Little Manila Historic Site is in the 99th percentile in California for asthma-related issues, according to Cal Enviro Screen. apparent residential community. And strangely, in August of 2018, and I close with a picture from her body past the building she saved. You see, children raised in redline communities are twice as likely to have asthma. And today, we just don't see Little Manila as a cultural and historic hub. It is also the entrance to South Stockton. It is the entrance to local marginalization. In response to her passing, we created the Dr. Dharma Balan Asthma Initiative, an initiative that has been funded by the California Air Resource Board. And we are leading the AB 617 efforts in Stockton. It's a law that is committing tens of millions of dollars to air quality in marginalized communities. We have now emerged as one of the top environmental justice organizations in our area. Meanwhile, we are continuing all programming that I mentioned earlier. We're doing census outreach. We're involved in the disbursement of emergency COVID-19 funds for our undocumented community. We are a litigant against the UC Regents for the use of SAT, ACT for college admissions. And with the Irvine Foundation and our community partners, we are creating an equitable and intentional plan for youth development in Stockton. And there's so much more we're actually involved in. And we came to this in a very organic way. And for us, it began with historic preservation. And over the past 20 years, we have learned that trauma doesn't need the California Preservation Foundation or the National Trust to preserve itself. And that you cannot preserve from the margins. You cannot preserve when the culture of a community says that progress is a McDonald's. You cannot remove the threat of a wrecking ball when there are wrecking balls parked in front of every single one of our youth that still need to be removed. You cannot preserve if you are coming from a colonized mindset. And you cannot give value to a building if there's no understanding of the value of people that inhabited them. We believe that the historic preservation of a marginalized community can only happen if you actually confront the injustices that led to marginalization and the long-lasting trauma that still lingers today. And we believe that historic preservation of a marginalized history is a fruit of social justice. Thank you.
Wow, Dylan, thank you. Thank you for kicking us off. That was powerful and important. Thank you. I want to turn it over to Eliza, and we'll keep going.
Thanks so much. That's great. Hi. Whoops. Let me share my screen and we'll start. Can we all see? So my name is Eliza Tudor. I'm Executive Director of Nevada County Arts Council and a member of the Board of Directors for Californians for the Arts and California Arts Advocates. UNESCO identifies oral traditions and expressions, including language, as a vehicle for intangible cultural heritage. I'd like to share with you today a short story which connects the recovery of an all but lost language with all that is important in centering social equity in time and place in our small corner of California. In 2017, Nevada County Arts Council led 2 successful applications for state designation as California Cultural Districts. This was a competitive process, resulting in only 14 districts statewide, 2 of which are now within Nevada County. 70% of our county is forested, implying swathes of wilderness and areas of outstanding natural beauty which remain mostly uninhabited today. From the foothills of the Sierra Nevada at 2,500 feet, that's gold country, to almost 8,000 feet in the rugged High Sierra. This is what it looks like driving between our cultural districts. These photos show the famous Donner Pass by both road on the left, that's Highway 80, and rail on the right. This railway line carries the California Zephyr all the way from San Francisco's Bay Area in the west to Chicago in the east. Our home is rugged and wild and beautiful. And our townships are known for their rich cultural life, yet mostly for their relationship to colonial heritage and the legacies of gold mining. A year before being awarded our designations, we began to work with our local Nisenan tribe. It felt unthinkable to us to exclude the Nisenan in our conversations about history, culture, place, and belonging. And it was clear to us that the story of our earliest peoples remained profoundly under-recognized. And not only this, but that what cultural legacies did remain from our gold mining heritage alone were riddled with ironies connected with exploitations of other cultures that remain in place today. Here, for example, you can see our community's annual celebration of the Chinese Lunar New Year, with our parade taking place directly in front of the old mining machinery, now proud pieces of public art, which is so symbolic of the mistreatment of early Chinese settlers who were brought here to serve the industry. In 2016, Shelley Covert, then Executive Director of California Indigenous Research Project and, to this day, spokesperson for the Nisenan, accepted our invitation to join our board of directors. Together, we set to work mapping places of historical significance to the Nisenan, a sensitive project, and this became a core part of our work in shaping our application for state designation. Then, in late 2018, we were introduced to Of, By, For All's Change Network. At last, we felt we'd found a solid framework to help us deepen our community impact, advance goals around diversity and inclusion, lend us vital tools towards professional development and cultural equity, and develop new community-centered ways of working. Of, By, For All was the beginning of a journey for us, and it connects us today with our aims towards cultural planning, cultural competency, and thought leadership, and to our unique role as state-local partner with the California Arts Council. So Of, By, For All required in our first year only that we choose one community and really commit to it. We didn't think twice. We applied to California Arts Council's Local Impact Program for a grant to fund a project close to our hearts, connected to the Nisenan language. With Nevada City Film Festival, we then agreed a partnership with the Nisenan to create a film, Nisenanamni, I Am Nisenan. As our initiative progresses, the Nisenan are learning important filmmaking and communication skills, such as storytelling, cinematography, locations, self-financing, and documentary interview techniques. Most importantly, they are controlling the film's voice and vision. But who are the Nisenan? So they've lived on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada for close to 13,000 years, and the gold rush saw a near genocide of them. In 1913, they gained federal recognition along with 76 acres of reservation. That's just 76 acres. In 1964, this status was terminated, along with 43 other California rancherias and their land sold at auction. Today, Nevada City Rancheria is one of only 3 statewide that remains unrecognized as a sovereign nation. We hope and are fighting for this to change. The tribe itself has 145 members, where once it had over 7,000. Here, Shelley Covert, speaking of her tribal members' attempts to relearn and rediscover their language.
Growing up, I had been told by a very well-meaning friend, unfortunately, your language is extinct and it won't be spoken again among the people.
That sound correct? Or
I grew up most of my life believing that our language was extinct. Yet at the same time, my grandma's sitting in the other room singing and teaching us songs and telling us words. Up until the day she died, she was still remembering words. I think that the language is the glue for the entire culture. Not having the language really made us sad, and I think we felt super empty without it. That longing, though, to speak the language came at a really early age. And I think that is why we're so adamant to get it back, because language is the conduit into the rest of the culture.
There you go. So now we've got your hip him up.
I think the first thing that I learned in Nisenan, came from my grandfather and my grandmother. And from my grandma, it was her song about the lizard. Pi chakamokampai hate zetisimpe. From grandpa, I learned the name of our sacred mountain, Estamiani, where all life comes from for us and where we go when we die. So knowing that that language connects us to everything who we are, to grow up as a person who didn't have language, I felt disconnected in some ways, but at the same time, as every word I learned, word. I think that's the beauty of language class, going and learning. We come out with this deeper connection to our culture and to the landscape here.
So our partnership is testament to Nisenan language recovery as one of the most significant assets in rebuilding a resilient, equitable community on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada in Nevada County, California. The story of Nisenan efforts to research national archives in rediscovering the long forgotten words of their ancestors are being recorded, along with these efforts of the Nisenan elders with their younger members to preserve and pass on, while they continue to work with linguists in capturing the Nisenan story. But as well as documenting efforts to revive an all but long lost language, the Nisenan are also looking to their future. 20 years from now, what will their homelands look like? What will our children be taught in schools? How will we, the broader community, experience Nisenan culture as a critical, valued part of our everyday story? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eliza. That's another really important story, and I'm so excited to see all these presentations for the first time. I'm going to turn it over to Erica now. We're running just a few minutes behind time, so we're all going to speak as fast as we can. Thanks.
Definitely. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Good morning. My name is Erica Schultz, and first I'd like to say that I'm reflecting on about 15 years of experience as a preservation consultant. I am based here in San Francisco, although all of the thoughts I will share are my own. I also want to augment that by identifying as a privileged white woman, and I'm at the very beginning of learning and confronting my own racism, diving into existing scholarship, and entering into the initial messy phase of white anti-racist activism. Am I a racial and social justice warrior? No. Can I be doing more, do better? Absolutely yes. And do I still have a lot to learn? Most humbly, yes. But digging into my discomfort and lack of historical knowledge, tools, and action as a privileged white person and as a historic preservation professional, and engaging in self-reflection is a starting point. I'd like to share my recent thoughts on historic preservation and racial and social equity. And I'm primarily going to examine the Historic Resource Evaluation, or HRE, which is a bread and butter report type for preservation consultants, particularly here in California, where projects are undergoing review under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. At the outset of starting a historic resource evaluation, and for those of us who prepare these, you know the drill. We visit the property and take photographs and comb through official written records. And very rarely do we speak with people who have knowledge about or connections with the property. And all of this is done in, let's say, a 2-month time frame. In addition to asking who designed this building or who lived here, I should also be asking, what are my biases as a privileged white person when it comes to this building or this place or this community? I've seen discussion on how the preservation field needs to expand and be more diverse and inclusive, or that our toolbox needs to expand, such as in the excellent essays in this National Trust Forum Journal. but less so on how professionals like myself who identify as white need to engage in self-reflection on bias and racism. And that's why a 2017 paper discussing equity in historic preservation law struck a chord. The author, Annika Olson, discusses the case study of the Shady Acres Mobile Home Park in Ellensburg, Washington, seen in the upper left. It had recently been purchased by the county for an expansion of the adjacent rodeo. It is predominantly home to a tight-knit community of mostly Latino homeowners who sought local register designation to protect their community from demolition. They were informed by preservation professionals that, quote, though lamentable, the site would probably not meet the eligibility thresholds to be considered historic at the local level, end quote. The community is prevented from accessing preservation regulations that could help save their community. She counters this by stating that the property could be nominated as, quote, a location important to the generational Latino working class community in the area, which has historically worked to support the ranching and rodeo functions often touted by the town's boosters, end quote. It reminded me of recent reporting on the redevelopment of several mobile home parks on the San Francisco Peninsula, including those in Sunnyvale and East Palo Alto, an example of which is on the lower right. These comprise decades-old affordable housing communities, or in familiar words, they meet the age threshold to be evaluated as a historical resource under CEQA. And so I asked myself, what if an HRE for a mobile home park housing predominantly Latinx residents landed on my desk? If I'm being honest, I'd probably side with, although lamentable, not eligible, leaning heavily on a lack of architectural significance. But is this about architectural bias, or should we really be asking, is this about race-class bias, bias against low-income communities of color? I'm sure many of us have local history and architectural guidebooks on our shelf, but I also recommend adding anti-racist scholarship in history. I highly recommend Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I don't have time to go into detail, but he defines racism and anti-racism with clarity that for me shows a path forward, one that will include more structured training. But you can substitute a wealth of books, webinars, and training sessions. Pick one and just start. And this self-reflection exercise is truly not profound or original. After attending the 2019 National Trust for Historic Preservation Conference, Dr. Marissa Angel Brown with the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage at Brown University wrote that, quote, in truth, I don't know that I've ever been to a conference where there's such a pervasive sense of the programs, the legislation, the research, the funding, the educational structure, the culture, the professional identity, all of the things that constitute a field of practice are somehow not in sync with the kind of work that needs to be done, end quote. I love this summary because I feel like I've read over and over, we need to change, we need to be more engaged with and responsive to diverse communities. She recommends reaching out to public history and humanities programs, libraries, and archives who are a decade ahead of preservationists. And that's why I found Of, By, For All, which Eliza just described, to be an intriguing partnership for preservation organizations. In HRE reports, we are searching for the properties that have significance, and this is the inherent conflict in historic preservation. First, you identify the context, then you evaluate whether a property is significant within that context, and then you decide if it retains physical integrity. It has to have something that sets it apart from the rest of that category of properties. But this decision-making process to find the significant does not allow us to address systematic racism as it has manifested in the built environment. I've been thinking about this inherent conflict with respect to the use of restrictive covenants in the early 20th century, particularly in San Francisco, and wanting to know how pervasive were they. If you're not familiar with restrictive covenants, they are legal clauses included in deeds that state an owner can only sell or rent to Caucasians. Their enforcement was deemed illegal by the US Supreme Court in 1948. I can recall vividly the ice-cold horror and shock that I felt as I read this language in the original deed to my 1930s house, an excerpt of which is seen at the bottom. My house is in a row of modest early 1930s Stonson Brothers homes in what is presently known as the Outer Mission. The use of restrictive covenants is known in San Francisco, for example, in the exclusive Presidio Terrace neighborhood, seen in the upper left-hand corner, which was developed in 1905 for whites only and has been subject to scholarly research. But what about the vast swaths of stucco boxes constructed along the west and south sides of the city? Some of these are known, but many are not. If you were to look at my block, seen on the right, you may conclude that it contains charming but common examples of 1930s residences, not individually significant, but maybe a district based on design. Is one house or one neighborhood significant for the use of restrictive covenants? I'm sure none of us would conclude that. So what do? Not talk about a restrictive covenant in HRE? I've done that. Write about it in the context of an HRE, but say it's not eligible? I've yet to do that. By saying it's not eligible, not significant, are you saying that it does not matter, that it's all in the past? Okay, so then what's the flip side? That the use of restrictive covenant at this property is not significant? And I'd like to end with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. This is a national memorial to commemorate the victims of lynching in the United States. It was founded by the Equal Justice Institute in 2018, and it's on my bucket list of places to visit when travel resumes. It contains over 800 steel monuments, one for each county in the United States where a racial terror lynching took place. Individual names are inscribed on the monuments, and there's an identical monument for each county to claim and a project to collect soil at each lynching site. What I find so compelling about this memorial is that it frames over 4,000 individual lynchings holistically, such that you can see the scale and sustained pattern of racial terror within the national landscape. This collection of soil samples ties each lynching to a specific place. It is saying these individual lynchings matter. They happened at a specific location and are part of the history of a specific community and part of the history and legacy of the country as a whole. One is not more significant than the other. Much in the same way that we should think about restrictive covenants or any sustained pattern of residential segregation. Yet this is in conflict with how the historic resource evaluations and CEQA process plays out. We do need to acknowledge that CEQA is a structured decision-making process, and a decision has to be made because a specific action to a specific property or properties has been proposed, but we also miss the bigger picture and something is lost. And unlike archives and museums that are a decade ahead of us, we have this significance hierarchy used in a decision-making process that can profoundly impact diverse communities and the places they value. As highlighted in the work of Little Manila Rising, the residential segregation that happened in the past continues to impact communities of color that we seek to partner and work with. And with that, I'll hand it over to Shelley.
Thank you so much. Your presentation hits very close to home, and having practiced in historic resource evaluations for many years. And you're spot on. I'm going to share my screen now. Oh, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, hold on 1 second.
And I'll get started in just a second. It should be up at the top, I think.
Yeah. Where did it go? Sorry.
That's okay. I can go ahead and get started. I want to try to save as many minutes for questions at the end as we can. So as I mentioned before, I'm a cultural heritage planner with the City of San Francisco, with the Planning Department. I live in Concord in the East Bay, in the Bay Area. And for the past, oh, sorry, I can't drive and talk at the same time. I'm going to pull up my presentation. There we go. Sorry for the speeding. And run down to my presentation. Almost there. Okay. So for the past couple of years, my title has been Cultural Heritage Specialist within the department. And what that really boils down to is that I help facilitate a conversation between marginalized cultural groups in the city and the planning department and other government agencies about how we can recognize and protect the heritage of those cultural groups, both tangible and intangible. It's been a really interesting place to work for the last couple of years. And it's no coincidence that the cultural groups that are at highest risk of disappearing from San Francisco are the same people that had been historically discriminated against, oppressed, and displaced because of their race, ethnicity, sexuality, or gender expression. For the past 3 years, our department has been strategizing about how we as an urban planners can address the racial and social equity that persists in our city. And this year, the city established an Office of Racial Equity and set a goal to create racial and social equity action plans for each of our departments. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to give you an overview of our department's action plan, focusing specifically on the historic preservation component. So why create an action plan to address equity now, and why do it in the planning department? Because racial disparities in San Francisco are either stagnating or increasing across nearly every measure. While we may feel that the Bay Area bubble is an open and welcoming place for cultural and racial diversity, there is still work to be done, especially at the structural and institutional level, to eliminate these disparities that we see in incomes, life expectancy, health, homeownership, education, and the list goes on. Also, when we look at the demographics of our department and city government employees, we see that we could be much more representative of the marginalized communities that we serve, especially in management and policymaking positions. As you probably know, government and planning as a field has historically played a significant role in generating and perpetuating racial and social inequity, whether through upholding racial covenants, redlining, as shown in this map here of San Francisco, renter and homebuyer discrimination, urban renewal, exclusionary zoning, etc. This has contributed to structural racism expressed in our zoning land uses that has to be deliberately undone. Not only do we have an obligation to address equity as a historic participant in creating these disparities, but we have a responsibility as government to advance racial and social equity simply because it's the right thing to do. This will improve the quality of life of our residents. So this is roughly what our plan looks like. We started with an examination in phase 1 of our internal workings as an organization and created trainings and tools to make sure that our staff can integrate the value of racial equity into all aspects of our work. And now we're in phase 2, began about a year ago, where we're examining our outward facing operations. How do we do our work, and are we doing it in a way that promotes equity? We've broken out historic preservation as one of our operational divisions, and I think it's been important to recognize that historic preservationists can bring an essential tool to advancing equity. We bring to light the histories of the racial inequities we see today so that we can find the root and remove it. We started this exercise by examining the history of our own practice and identifying root causes of inequity in our work, of which these are just a few. If you look at the landmark designation list for our city, it primarily represents places of power and wealth, the mansions, fancy neighborhoods, the big businesses of their day, which leaves out the stories of a lot of folks. We know that this is in part a result of years on focusing on design and architectural merit for significance. And I think that as a profession, we are starting to correct for this bias. Next, we identified the underrepresentation of people of color and other marginalized groups in the history profession. We all naturally bring unconscious biases to our work, and those biases are more likely to go unnoticed and uncorrected in a group that is too homogeneous, which hinders our ability to make informed decisions about historical significance. Next, we recognize that there has been a prioritization of material preservation over the safeguarding of the intangible aspects of culture. And we are starting to look at models for safeguarding the practices and knowledge of peoples that may not have had the privilege or tradition of conveying meaning through their built environment. And these last two causes reflect how we do research, which Erica spoke about. In San Francisco, it's rare that our research scopes include community outreach or oral histories, which can leave us blind to the social and historical significance of a place because it may not have been recorded in the written record. And the Compton's Cafeteria riot is an example where there's very little recorded about the event itself in the newspapers or writings of the time. However, it was an event that marked the beginning of transgender activism in San Francisco. With this understanding of the causes of inequity in our practice, we developed our goal statement, which you can see on the slide here, and our objectives, which are focused on our primary functions, which are identification of cultural resources, protection and management of those resources, and promotion of preservation action in the community through education, technical assistance, and incentives. Of 33 proposed actions, we've identified 7 priorities that we would like to initiate in the first year. 3 of these fall into the identification of resources category, which makes sense given how much we know that we don't know about our marginalized communities. We want to explore the use of traditional cultural property frameworks to identify spaces that are significant for their cultural use rather than their physical elements. We want to prioritize completing our African American, Chinese American, and Latinx historic context statements, and we want to pursue more historic context statements for ethnic and other cultural groups. And we want to develop an outreach and engagement process that invites more of the community into our scoping and framing process for research projects. We have 2 resource management priorities, which are to assess our relatively underutilized Mills Act program to understand if we can make it more accessible to a broader portion of our residents. We also want to establish best practices for the rehabilitation of cultural resources that are largely significant for their intangible qualities, such as those that are associated with a cultural group or practice. I'm sure you've all struggled with those ugly duckling buildings that no one appreciates because they can't see what took place there or who occupied it. Last, we want to increase educational opportunities, incentives, and funding for low-income homeowners to make it easier to understand and implement preservation standards so that we can truthfully say that designation is not a burden. And we want to prioritize landmarking cultural resources associated with people of color and other marginalized groups. And that will entail starting to track the cultural associations of the landmarks so that we can understand how truly representative our registry is of our city's history. This is just a sampling of what our preservation team wants to do. Our next steps are to develop performance measures and baseline data so that we can understand if we're progressing towards our goal. The entire draft plan will be published for public review this fall, and we hope to adopt it by the end of the year. In the following year, we hope to move forward our historic conservation element of the general plan, which would convert many of these ideas into policy for equitable heritage practice in the city. And finally, we will reassess in 3 years and see how we are doing and rewrite the action plan if needed. So that's it. I'm going to turn it over to Trudy to close us out.
Okay, let me get myself sorted out here.
So hi everybody, while Trudy's getting that up, you can feel free to send your questions into the Q&A, or also you can send things, anything you might be interested in on the chat. I've seen a couple of people have been pretty active.
Okay, so I'm going to talk really fast. So we do have a little time for Q&A. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of education side of things and what we're doing now to train the next generation of professionals and activists in the field. And I have good news to share. This is kind of what I'm going to buzz through here real quickly. So who are these folks who are in our programs? I have the great good fortune of being the director of a program that has students of all ages and stages from all backgrounds across the country. We have geographic diversity, we have diversity in educational backgrounds, we have diversity in every metric you can think of. And that is really exciting. Those are the folks who are coming to our field now. And this isn't necessarily the case in every program around the country, but it certainly is in the West Coast programs. And I think the University of Oregon and USC, as well as the program at Cal Poly Pomona and others, are really seeing this diversity of applicants and students across the board. So that's exciting. Why are they interested? Well, like most of us, they are, in some cases, building huggers. They've had experience with a historic site in peril in some way. They are very interested in place and story and the ways in which the world is struggling with resilience and sustainability. They are perhaps influenced by a mentor, as many of us have been over the years. But often one thing that I hear from them is that they are interested in seeing themselves reflected in the historic record. And when, you know, we all know the statistics of the various local, state, and national registers that show that most of the landmarks and things that we already have do not reflect our population, our diversity across the board. And they're interested in making that change and telling their own stories and seeing themselves in the historic record. So that's kind of exciting. So how do we do this? Well, we read and talk a lot about these issues. And our program is really focused on identifying sites of underrepresented histories as a big focus of our entire program. And so our students do coursework, including things like an upcoming course we're having next semester, working with a nonprofit homelessness organization in Pasadena to identify potential sites for adaptive reuse and affordable housing. And so we're doing projects through our courses. There are 2 rites of passage for our students. They have to take a reading course that I get to teach, which is my favorite thing I get to do. And we read a book a week. I put here some of the different semesters, the books that we've read. And we go through and really plow through entire books that talk about all of these things. And for those of you who are probably already typing in the chat, wait, you're going too fast. I actually made a list of all this and I'm going to email it out to everyone. We're looking at a really diverse set of resources in terms of trying to get the students to think beyond just the nuts and bolts of what we do in heritage conservation, but really to question the why. Why do we do it? What are some of the issues that we're grappling with, historical and contemporary? Are we telling all the stories? And can we tell all the stories? Is that our role? Who do we need to be allied with? Should we be reaching out to the folklore community? Are we engaging with public historians in a meaningful way? We have people who have tool sets that we as conservationists maybe aren't as adept at using. How do we ally and partner with folks like that to help broaden our field and to bring more voices to the table? So what are the outcomes? What do we see as the result of all of this? So the second rite of passage for our students is that they all have to write a master's thesis, which many of you I know alums are on this thing. And so you're going to be delighted to see that your thesis titles are in here. So I went through and I just pulled out some of the ones that are dealing with sites of significance to communities that are not typically represented in the historic record or aspects of our field, just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that students are doing. When they pick their thesis topic, they are picking things that they are passionate about themselves. Something that really they feel like they want to dig into in a significant way. And we really encourage them to find something that they can really get excited about in order to do their scholarship. And so I just wanted to give you a sense of the sort of breadth of the scholarship that's coming out of these programs. And this is just our program at USC. This doesn't take into account what's happening in other programs all around the country, but certainly in University of Oregon, et cetera. So the other outcome is that our students are going out and helping to create some really great organizations, APIA HIP and Latinos in Heritage Conservation, Some of the folks who helped organize those are alums of our program. These are the folks who are going out and sort of creating our next advocacy and activist generations. And that's exciting too. And these are just two examples, but there's lots more out there at the local level in particular. And so that's pretty exciting. So I do have a significant diversity problem. And if you could look at this photo, I think you can identify what it is. These are graduates. There are no men, which is a weird problem to have, but most of our grads, most of our students are women. And I don't know why that is, but it's delightful. And it's an opportunity for us to really tell some great stories about what we're doing. And so I'm just gonna let it go at that and say there's hope for the next gen. And let's stop my screen sharing here and we'll go to some questions. All right.
Thanks, Trudy. Do you want to go ahead and I can ask the panelists something while you're, we do have a couple of questions that you might want to address. I was wondering with the panelists, can you maybe just say one or two words that come to your mind when you think about heritage preservation and diversity right now? Or is it frustrating? Is it positive? Are you optimistic? Who wants to go first? Shelley?
Sure. I am hopeful. I think that this has become the conversation in our department, in our city. It's bringing heritage conservation into the conversation about racial equity in our city, recognizing that we need to understand the history and the roots of these things. And we need to recognize the importance of our cultural diversity. And so I'm feeling energized and hopeful.
And I'll kick in here too. In our small corner of Northern California, in rural California, I'm very hopeful too. Just speaking, if I might, for the Nisenan tribe, I'm really hopeful. But what is extraordinary to me is how long it's taken to get to where we are, and that it wasn't more obvious to more people across, generations ago that this should be happening. In rather the same way that Dylan, you spoke to the idea of even 20 years ago in Little Manila, a McDonald's going up was considered progress. So it's both shocking to me and very hopeful at the same time.
I think for me, I'm hopeful and cautious because, although, I talk about the shift to seeing progress as not a McDonald's, that's not believed by all in our community. And so I think, like many other Central Valley communities in California, there are definitely issues that need to be addressed regarding equity. And like I was saying, I think historic preservation it will be an outcome of addressing those things.
And I'll just jump in and say I am energized by this conversation. I think even just having the opportunity to put some of these thoughts down on paper and share them publicly, something I hadn't really kind of pulling together some threads of things that I've been thinking about over the past couple of years, but not necessarily articulating, and just really hoping that this conversation continues. And if we, I'd love to connect with anyone after this. Maybe if we can get, a Bay Area or California workshop going or something, to continue this. And I know that I've seen this conversation pop up in other places across the country in different conferences. So
sorry, the bells are ringing, so I muted myself. So one of the questions was trying to soak in all the wonderful information and impactful work you all are doing. And so I may have missed any discussion on removing the systemic barriers. Can you tell me if you're addressing that as well as providing equity for the marginalized populations. So maybe Shelley?
Well, we're planning for removing the barriers. I guess we're in the planning stage right now. We're putting together this action plan in San Francisco for our department, but then each of our agencies is responsible for creating their own action plan. So these action plans are meant to take a hard look at structural racism within their own institutions, and then develop a plan to deconstruct it. So like I mentioned that we have a list of 33 different actions we could take, and each one would start to chip away at structural racism. You know, it's a systematic problem which requires multiple, ways to address it, and it's a cultural change too. It's a cultural shift, so it's not going to be done tomorrow or next year or in 10 years. And the solutions aren't always absolutely clear as to how you undo something or create justice for to address the trauma in our society. So I think that's going to be the harder part. The truly holding justice as the goal, and repairing reparations is a word that is coming up, and we're not exactly sure what that looks like. What does reparations look like for our city?
I personally don't believe that it's possible to remove the structures. I think it's about remaining vigilant, and I'm hearkened to the civil rights era, and how really just a few years ago we had Nazis protesting in America, and literally right now, over 90,000 people have died in America right now, and there's people that that means very little value, have very little value in the way we conduct ourselves presently today. And so it's hard for me to believe that those can be completely removed, but I have faith in more people being vigilant and taking action. I think there always has to be a resistance.
Trudy, did you want to just take a few more minutes? I think we could have maybe 5 more minutes of questions before we sign off, since there seems to be a lot of interest in this particular panel.
Okay. There's a question, why are West Coast schools more diverse than others throughout the US? That is an excellent question. I don't know if there is, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think that in part people are attracted to our programs because we are grappling with these issues. And even though my program is at USC is based in an architecture school, you don't need to be an architect to be a part of our program. And so perhaps that's a barrier. Some preservation programs are really design based, and that is super important, and we need that as well. But there are 36 different programs around the country, and we each have our own sort of specializations. And it just seems that the West Coast schools are really reflecting not only the conversations that we're having in our field, but the population of our states as well, which are, quite diverse and in every aspect. So maybe that's part of it. Let's see. Other questions? Chris, do you have one?
Yeah, let's ask one more, and then we should probably log off, because the other people for the next session will be coming into our room in a minute. Wayne Johnson was just talking about how, as the chair of the ACHB, he's trying to build a board that was diverse, and things started happening. What kind of actions can someone take immediately to ensure getting more diversity to the constituents, either on the board or in the participants. You all have done such a great job in the community outreach. How can somebody else expand that when they're faced with the same challenges?
I mean, for us, I think you have to take a risk. And, you know, when we started Little Manila, our board was made up of people that have never been on a board. And I mean, you know, like for us, we don't work with a marginalized community. We are a marginalized community. And so I think one of the things that we need to understand is some of the ways that our society is built is really, you know, a product of privilege. Like, I think we think that this knowledge, there's a knowledge base that is accessible to all. But for some reason, definitely this knowledge base, a certain knowledge base does not get passed on to certain communities. And I believe that's been done purposefully to preserve power and those who hold it. And so it's incumbent, I think it's about people in those positions taking a risk, but then also people that have never been in those positions taking a risk as well.
Did anyone else want to make any last comments on that? And then we can start wrapping it up. How about you, Trudy, same?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that, I have to say, this was super, none of us had practiced with each other, so I didn't know what everybody's presentations were going to be. And I was totally distracted all the way through listening to everybody's presentations and writing notes. And so I was not following all the comments and everything as much as I should have, because I was really listening to everybody. This is exciting and important to be having this conversation. And I know that we keep dancing around the edges of it in lots of places. And in particular, I think, Erica, you addressed things in a very head-on way that I think a lot of people in their secret little minds are thinking about, but maybe are not actually willing to say out loud. So I think that was really important too, because I do think these conversations are taking place quietly, or maybe in our own heads, but not necessarily in forums like this.
And I actually agree with that. I think when you spoke about what are we actually doing to remove barriers to justice, for us in Nevada County, in our small community, I'd say it's all about building public will for the thing itself, for justice at the moment. And that is a process. And at the moment, for all the power that those in power hold, there is still a little bit of a sense of lip service to the cause. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in building public will. I think that's a critical first and ongoing step. It probably never ends, but for us, while things are hopeful, you know, there's still a lot of work to be done.
That's wonderful. I think we should probably wrap up so we don't go too close to the next session. But wanted to thank everyone for joining. People who are in the participants, if you want to put in the chat, would you support having maybe another webinar, maybe in the fall, extending this conversation? It seems to me that there's a lot of interest in this, and all of you have presented research that, like Trudy's saying, is all new to me, and I really appreciate your effort to serve underserved communities in historic preservation. I want to thank you all for your expertise and for your time. And just a reminder to everybody to catch our other events today. Our next session starts in about a half hour, and we have a lunchtime presentation starting at noon. So thank you again, everybody, and we'll see you in the next session. Bye.
Bye. Thanks,
so
everybody.
much. Great to be with you all.
Thanks.